I walked down the highway to Selma eating black walnuts from the walnut tree. I went on the SP tracks and balanced along the rail. I passed a water tower and a factory. This was the end of something. I went to the telegraph office off the railroad for my money order from New York. It was closed. I swore and sat on the steps to wait. The ticket master got back and invited me in. The money was in. My mother had saved my lazy ass again.
Who's going to win the World Series next year?
Said the gaunt old ticket master. I suddenly realized it was fall and that I was going back to New York, and a joy piled up to the top of me. I told him it would be the Braves and the Red Sox. Turned out to be the Braves and the Indians, World Series 1948. But now it was 1947, year of grace. In the great sear October, I was leaving the San Joaquin Valley, and in that moment, things were happening in Texas that I must tell about now, to give richness to the circumstances that made Neil and I crisscross and miss each other in the land that fall. Neil and Alan lived in Bill Burroughs' bayou shack for a month. They slept on a cot. So did Hunky. Bill and Joan had a bedroom with the baby girl, Julie. The days were all the same. Bill got up first, went puttering in the yard where he was growing a marijuana garden and where he was constructing a Reichian orgone accumulator. This is an ordinary box, big enough for a man to sit inside on a chair. A layer of wood, a layer of metal, and another layer of wood gathers in orgons from the atmosphere and holds them captive long enough for the human body to absorb more than a usual share. According to Reich, orgons are atmospheric vibratory atoms of the life principle. People get cancer because they run out of orgons. Bill thought his orgone accumulator would be improved if the wood he used was as organic as possible. So he tied bushy bayou leaves and twigs to his mythical outhouse. It stood there in the hot, flat yard, an exfoliate machine clustered and bedecked with maniacal contrivances. Bill slipped off his clothes and went in to sit and moon over his navel. He came out roaring for breakfast and sex. His long, gaunt body struggled back to the shack, his shriveled and vulturous neck barely supporting the bony skull in which was stored all that accumulated knowledge from 35 years of crazy life. More of him later. "Joan," he said, "you got breakfast ready? If you haven't, I'll go catch me a catfish. Neil, Alan, you're sleeping your lives away. Young men like you, get up. We got to drive to McAllen. Get some groceries." For about 15 minutes, he glowed and bustled around the house, rubbing his hands together eagerly. When everybody got up and dressed, Bill's day was finished. All his energy had run out. The orgons had slipped out of the million orifices in his weaseled flanks and withered arms where he plied the morphine needle. Joan tried to find him. He was hiding in his room, taking the first fix of the morning. He came out glassy-eyed and calm. Neil did all the driving from the moment he met Bill. He was his chauffeur. They had a Jeep. They drove to crossroads stores and bought groceries and Benzedrine inhalers. Hunky came along with them, hoping they'd go as far as Houston so he could slip into the streets and mingle with the characters. He was tired of wearing a straw hat and carrying buckets of water for Joan. There's a photo of him raking the marijuana garden with his immense straw hat. He looks like a coolie. The shack is in the background with wash buckets on the porch and little Julie standing there shading her eyes to watch. There's another photo of Joan simpering over a cook pot. Her hair is long and unkempt. She's high on Benny. God knows what she's saying as the camera snapped. "Don't point that nasty old thing at me." Neil wrote me long letters on a crate telling me everything. He sat at Bill's feet in the front room. Bill snuffed down his nose and told long stories. When the sun turned red, Bill always whipped out a stick of homegrown tea for the general appetite. Everybody blasted as they ran hither and yon in the shack at various chores. Then Joan cooked a lovely supper. They sat over the remains, beady-eyed Alan brooding and saying, in the big Texas night. Eager Neil yelling, "Yes, yes," to everything everybody said. Sulky, weary Joan turning her face away, and Bill, Uncle Bill they called him, sitting with his long legs crossed and fingering his shotgun. He suddenly leaped up and let go a double-barrel blast out the open window. A spavined old runaway horse ran across his line of fire. The buckshot ripped through a rotted bayou trunk. "My God!" cried Bill. "I've shot a horse." They all ran out. The horse was galloping into the swamps. You mean that wormy old nasty old thing? Scoffed Joan. That's not a horse. What if it ain't a horse? What if it ain't? What if it ain't a horse? Alistair says it's a witch. Alistair was a gloomy farmer neighbor who sat on his fence all day. He said,
The trouble with the world is,
he said,
there's just too many Jews.
with his long beaked nose sniffing in the air. He had a divining rod and walked around with it. When it tipped from his palm, he claimed there was water below. How does that divining rod work? Asked Bill.
It ain't it so much as me,
Said Alistair. He came over one day just as he arrived. It started to thunder.
Well, I guess I brought the rain with me.
He said gloomily. The gang sat around playing Billie Holiday records in the Texas Bayou night. Hunky predicted the end of the world would start in Texas. There's just too many chemical plants, chain gangs around here. I can feel it in the air. It's all sinister. Joan agreed. The chain reaction will start here. They talked about the Texas City explosion, which they'd all heard one afternoon. All their heads nodded in confirmation of this apocalyptic event. It won't be long, said Joan. Bill snuffed down his nose and kept his secrets to himself. Hunky, little dark Hunky with the oriental face, went out at night and picked rotten sticks in the bayou. He discovered new kinds of worms. Finally, he said he began to find them in his skin. He spent hours at the mirror picking them out. Then the time came for all of them to move to New York. Bill suddenly got bored with the bayou. He had an income of $50 a week from his family. He always had a big roll in his pocket. He sent Joan and the baby girl by train, and he and Hunky and Neil would drive up by jeep. Alan entered in a gloomy period which he called the bayou doldrums. Neil was tired of the terrible strain of talking with Alan all the time, and they began to wrangle. Alan went down to the Houston waterfront, suddenly found himself in the Union Hall, signing on a ship for Dakar, West Africa. 2 days later, he shipped out. He returned to New York 2 months later, wearing a bushy beard and the Dakar doldrums under his arm. Neil drove Bill and Hunky and a few household things in the Jeep to New York. He didn't stop once. Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and on up. They arrived in Manhattan at dawn and went straight to Vicky with an ounce of tea that she bought at once. They were broke. Neil drove Bill around metropolitan New York in search of an apartment. Hunky disappeared on Times Square and was finally arrested for carrying weed and given a stretch on Rikers Island. The evening that Bill Burroughs finally found an apartment was the California afternoon that I left Selma. I was eager to find them and join them. I walked along the tracks in the long, sad October light of the valley, hoping for an SP freight to come along so I could join the grape-eating hobos and read the funnies with them. It didn't come. I got out on the highway and hitched a ride.